To give you a little bit of background, the bipartisan State of the Nation project is America's progress report. It tackles one of the most pressing questions of our time: how are we doing as a country? The State of the Nation project brings together a diverse group of thoughtful leaders from across the political spectrum. This includes leaders in 7 of the nation's leading think tanks, such as Brookings and the American Enterprise Institute. This also includes people like Arthur Brooks and Robert Putnam. This includes senior officials and advisors to the past 5 presidential administrations. And finally, it includes feedback from over 1,000 Americans. This diverse group of people identified 37 measures across 15 key topics that capture America's progress. These measures serve as a vital indicator of our nation's well-being. The State of the Nation project does not measure our path to success, but provides a compass for finding it. Their top finding this year: we are a nation of extremes, extreme successes and extreme failures. For example, U.S. ranks near the top of the world on economic measures, but near the bottom on mental health. That gets us to today's focus, and UTA is excited to support this event because the State of the Nation project has just launched the 250th anniversary edition, featuring its first State of the States project. The Utah Foundation is the project's partner in releasing Utah's progress report. First, we'll hear from Sean Teigen from the Utah Foundation, our president and CEO, who will delve into the comparisons between Utah and other states. And then we'll be pleased to hear from Robert Spendlove from Zions Bank, who graciously are hosting us today, and we always have appreciated their support. And then from Loris Summers from the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. Please give a welcoming round of applause to Mr. Sean Teigen.
Hey, thank you so much, Carlton. So I'm going to be talking today kind of place setting for the more important discussion that you're going to hear from Robert Spendlove and Laura Summers. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this report that's the State of the States report that focuses on Utah. And I'm not going to go through all these metrics. This looks a little bit different than that chart we had up a minute ago. I'm not going to go through all these. I'm going to focus on some of those extremes that Carlton mentioned. So I'm going to look at some places we're doing well and some places where maybe we're not doing very well. And we encourage you, we'll have a link to this report and some other materials on our website later today. I encourage you to go check that stuff out. If you remember, this is what the nation looks like. So as just an overview, there's a lot of red. Red means bad. It means bad. Yellow means, maybe it's kind of on the fence. Green means good. There's a lot of red on this one. When you look at a slightly different layout for Utah, there's not a lot of red. It looks like overall, we're doing better than the nation. One of the things that the State of the Nation project does not do is say, this state is number 1, this state is number 2. Instead, they look at kind of rankings across a whole 14 different categories. One of the other reasons why this looks a little bit different than this list here, this is 37 categories. And again, this was chosen by a bipartisan group of folks. And there are a lot of metrics that didn't make this list because one group or another, they couldn't come to agreement on this. I mean, there was a huge amount of effort put into getting this bipartisan list together. This looks different for a couple of reasons, because that other list of metrics looks at countries, looking at the United States and other countries. This looks at the states. The data are quite a bit different, and they didn't come to an agreement on quite as many items. So we've got just 31 metrics across these 14 different categories. And so some of these categories just have one thing in them. A lot of things just weren't chosen to be added to this list at the end of the day, a lot of the metrics. So one of the things that we do well in this State of the States project, where we compare ourselves to other states, is social capital. In fact, we're number 1. We're number 1 in social capital. That is something that the Utah Foundation found last year. We looked at for this project alone, for this one metric, one factor alone, 34 different factors. Put those together into an index, and to understand like how we're doing in terms of the relationships between entities and organizations and people, and that we come to rely upon. So how we're doing in Utah, it turns out, Utah is the highest social capital. We've been at the top, depending on how you measure it, for the last 12 years. So we're really excellent there. And this is one of actually the only reason why I have this picture up here is because this is one of the only pictures that the Utah Foundation has ever paid for in its 81 years. We got this from the Deseret News, and I was like, I'm just going to use this at social capital. It's a good representation of social capital, and I just love this picture. There's another one with the temple in the background. It's also amazing. But volunteerism, we're number one. In terms of where we're trending, that yellow mark, that yellow dot looks at the trends. So we're trending, maybe we're decreasing our volunteerism a little bit, but in terms of number one, this is from the Utah Foundation Social Capital Project report. Utah is far above Vermont, which is in second place. So we're doing really well there. We're up on the left. And this is a figure that they include that you see in the state for the state report. Where Utah is that blue line, we're far higher volunteerism than the nation, which is that gray line. So we're doing really great in terms of volunteerism. We're also doing great in terms of kind of these family-child issues. So we look at children living with a single parent. We're number one. That doesn't mean we have the most children living with single parents. It means we have the least in the nation from the data that they choose, but this is also, the red dot there, but this is also not improving, or the way they measure this is going down. There's not a lot of movement, but there's enough movement to suggest that maybe we're losing ground a little bit in terms of children living with a single parent. We also are really great in terms of income inequality, which means we have low income inequality. That's another metric where we're heading in the, perhaps a little bit stable, but depending on how you look at it, we might be headed in the wrong direction. The higher you get on this Gini coefficient scale, the more inequality we have. So we're below the U.S., which is the gray line, but that blue line, it's still been trending up over time, but not too worrisome according to the State of the Nation project at this point. Those are where we're at number one in terms of these metrics. We've also got a few where we're pretty high up there. The reason why I chose productivity is because one of the topics we're talking about today is the economy, and this is the way they look at the economy. So productivity, it's all about gross domestic product divided by the number of hours that are being used for us as we work to achieve that gross domestic product. And you see that the Utah tracked along with the U.S. as it increased over time, but it's actually, Utah's pulling away a little bit over the last several years. You see that blue line is pulling away. We're getting a little bit more productive. And that has to do with the whole, maybe we're just awesome in Utah. Maybe we've got some great ingenuity in terms of some of our processes. Maybe we have a lot of, maybe it has a little bit to do with some of the money at Silicon Slopes or whatever, who knows kind of where all this comes from. But we're doing pretty well in terms of this productivity measure. So as I want to kind of set the stage for Robert, and I've actually got one slide that Robert's going to kind of allude to as well. I want to talk a little bit about a couple things related to the economy. And one is that maybe people don't necessarily feel that we're doing that great in terms of economy. If you look at University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, the consumers have the lowest sentiment of their buying. How do you feel when you're out buying things? It's lower than it's ever been. This goes back to 1975, I think was it says on there. So we're not doing very well in terms of how consumers feel. This is a United States number. Robert's got a Utah number that I'll share with you. That may have a little bit to do with inflation. We have this inflation dashboard on the Utah Foundation website. There was actually just some data today. This is from last month. It's 3.8% for U.S. inflation. depending on, we don't have Utah inflation, but depending on a couple of different measures, we are, we're doing a little bit better in terms of inflation. At least we were last month. The data that came out today show that in terms of mountain states and U.S., they both have increased, and now they're both, I think, 4.2%. So inflation is getting a little higher. Most of that, if you look at this inflation dashboard too, you can see that that's we break it out by all these different factors. That's really driven by energy prices, and at least for the previous month's numbers, meat prices were pretty high too, and that probably frustrates some people when they go to the store and then they go and get a call from University of Michigan later, and they ask about their sentiment for as a consumer, and people are probably like, it would be fine except for that freaking steak that I bought today. It was twice the amount that it was a few months ago, and so people maybe are frustrated about that. Not everybody is frustrated. Oh, and and you can just see, like, we get into some details on that inflation index, and you'll see that the national inflation, that light blue line, was above mountain states until the numbers just came out today. But not everybody's feeling it, and this is also a little bit older picture. This is a slide I took on Monday. Who's going to see the NBA Finals this week? So on Monday, the cheapest ticket that you could get for the NBA Finals game that is tonight was $9,639. If you wanted courtside, it was a small $130,000 for a ticket there. This is the cheapest ticket. They're actually a little bit lower. I'm talking like basketball. I don't actually watch. I watch almost no basketball. I know one player that plays in the NBA, and I don't know his last name, but he's really tall and he plays for the Spurs, and his name is Victor. But apparently, given that they won a game, I guess people are now like, who knows how far it's going to go? Is it going to go to 4 games or 5 or 6 or whatever? I guess it goes beyond 4. I do know that. Anyway, it's not bad for everybody all the time. But one place where it's particularly bad in Utah, if you zoom in a little bit here, you can see in this area of mental health, where that's really the lion's share of the red on this little graphic that's put together for Utah's State of the State Index. And that has to do with the one on top and the one on the bottom of depression and suicide rate. So depression, and these data, Laura's got some data looking at some of these things too. You're going to see some differences in the data sources, the years, the kind of focus of the data, and the way they're measured. So you're going to see some differences in what she's got than what we've got here. But you'll see that the state trends that the State of the State report has, it has us trending in the wrong direction, and suicide rates and depression rates are really high. This is a super disconcerting couple of numbers here, and this is one of the things I really would love to hear from you all today when we chat about mental health issues after the presenters. May was Mental Health Awareness Month, and I think that in 2026, so we saw that suicide replaced COVID-19 as the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S. In 2024, we saw that 49,000 Americans died by suicide. 14 million adults thought seriously about suicide, and perhaps the scariest number of all was 2.8 million adolescents thought seriously about suicide or attempted suicide. So scary numbers, stuff we're going to talk about today. It's not all doom and gloom. We're first going to hear a little bit from Robert to get into the relatively rosy discussion, and then, like I said, after that, we'll hear from Laura. So thank you so much, Robert Spendlove from Zions Bank, for agreeing to come in today and take it away.
I'm going to do a little dance. When Sean we were talking earlier, and he said, okay, Robert, you're going to be the positive and Laura's going to be the negative. And I'm like, I can be the negative too. Like, I'm an economist. I can go negative really easily. So I guess it just depends on where the group wants me to go. But it's it's a really interesting time in the economy. So today was, like Sean said, kind of the big release of inflation. We got jobs report last week, and then we had our big inflation report today. And it's always interesting because if the number's good, no one cares. If the number's bad, then the world explodes. And right now, the world's exploding. And what's interesting is the inflation number was not a surprise. But it still hurts, right? 4.2% hurts. And so what are those implications? And I think, and I agree with Sean, I think a lot of what we're seeing with that consumer sentiment is tied to that affordability crisis that we're seeing in society. But let's look at Utah real quick. What are some of our unique characteristics that are really positive for Utah? Population growth. So while the nation is growing about 0.5%, Utah is growing 1%. Now, we're not the fastest in the country, but we're top tier. And it's been one of the areas that has fueled our economy for many years. There is a direct relationship between population growth and employment growth. When you can have too much population growth, and you see that in some areas where they kind of strain under population growth. But it's better to have population growth than the opposite. And so Utah, it's been a long story of growth for us. When you look at those components of the growth, though, you can see one of the unique parts about Utah is not only do we have net in-migration, and that's coming from either internationally or from other states. We have this kind of consistent net in-migration. We also have what we call natural increase, or our own births and deaths. And while our fertility rate is dropping and is becoming more similar to the US, it is one of those areas that we continue to have much higher natural increase than other states. And even where we had a little bit of a slowing of that natural increase, or kind of a baby bust, we're now starting to be on the uptick again. By the way, one of the things you'll notice is I steal a lot from the Gardners too. So whereas, yes, thank you very much Gardner does a great job. And so this is actually their analysis that they did. What about employment? Similar story, where the nation is around just barely positive in employment growth. Utah much stronger at 0.7%. You can also see that relative to other states in the country, we're kind of in the center of a really strong employment growth area. Now, if we look historically, so this is looking at the US versus Utah, that employment growth, what we are seeing, and I'll tell you, there are economists that are getting nervous about this chart for Utah specifically, that we are seeing that growth is slowing. Utah is still higher than the nation, but that relative growth is slowing over time. And if that growth, as it approaches zero, or if it approaches zero, it's going to be an area that's concerning. We're not seeing it yet, and the jobs report on Friday at the national level was a good report, so we may just kind of stall out at this level, which would be fine. But it is an area that we're paying attention to. Unemployment rate, another one of our big areas. So again, we're kind of in this sweet spot. The nation for the same period, 4.3%, Utah, 3.8%. So we're just a little bit below the national average, but we're not the lowest in the country. We're not the highest in the country. And by the way, you don't want to be either, right? You don't want to be Nevada and California. You also don't want to be North and South Dakota, where they've got labor shortages. And so we really are in a really good spot there. What about kind of comparing Utah to the nation? This is another area, I serve on the Utah Economic Council, and we debate this chart this is what nerdy economists do, we debate charts. And and I love this one because you're looking at different scenarios over time. So, we've got several different economic cycles, and which cycle is this most like? Is it like the lead up to the financial crisis of 08 and 09? Is it more like the mid-2000s or the late 20-teens? I feel like we're more like the mid-1990s, where we have seen our unemployment rate move up, but it's kind of stalled out in the last year or so, year to 18 months, and that's really rare. The unemployment rate is usually either moving up or moving down, but it's just been kind of holding at this level for the past year to year and a half, which again is a good thing. And so we're at a good spot there. What's the sign of trouble? I call this my jobs EKG. It is initial initial claims for unemployment insurance benefits. And this is kind of, if you lose your job, you go to the Department of Workforce Services and file a claim for unemployment insurance benefits. And we track that on a weekly basis. And if we see that start to move up, that's a sign of trouble. So last week was 1,200 people. That's really low. And in comparison, in the 1991 recession, it was above 2,000. In the 01-02 recession, it was above 3,000. In the Great Recession of 08 and 09, it's above 5,000. And then you see the pandemic where in 1 week, it's 32,000. So no signs of trouble there either. However, tell that to consumers. It is true, consumer sentiment is way down. So what you've got here is you've got the University of Michigan on the bottom, and then University of Utah working with us. We produced this a Utah version. It is higher than the nation, and so Utah consumers feel better than consumers at the national level. However, we saw a big drop just in the last couple months. So sentiment is down in both the nation and in Utah. It's down compared to before the pandemic, and it's down just in 2026. So you have to acknowledge that consumers don't feel good about the economy. However, they're still spending. This is what, you just scratch your head and you're like, they're grumpy, they're not happy, but they won't stop spending. And so why is it that there's kind of this disconnect in the economy? A big part of it is this affordability crisis, specifically with the inflation report today. Of that 4.2% inflation, most of that was increase in energy prices. Most of that was increases in gas prices, where energy prices are up almost 20%, and gas prices alone are up about 40%. Gas prices, and by the way, this number is kind of fluctuated. One thing just to point out with that inflation report that came out today, it was taken a few weeks ago, so it incorporates an older gas price number that was closer to about $4.60 a gallon. So we have seen that moving down. So next month we expect to see lower inflation, but this is a huge stress for the average consumer. Inflation is like a regressive tax, and it is taxing people because it has a bigger impact on lower income than it has on upper income. And then you go over to the other area, which is home prices. Home prices in Utah are not affordable. They've been moving up for years, and now we are one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. That wasn't true 10 years ago. That certainly wasn't true 20 years ago. But we're facing this affordability crisis in Utah, and people are struggling. How can you buy your first home? How can you even rent an apartment in a market that's so much more expensive? Just anecdotally, if you want to find cheap housing, it does exist. It's in West Virginia. So if you want to move to West Virginia, you can get a home for $175,000. But it requires a dramatic change to find lower housing. When we look at it a different way, again, back to great analysis from the Gardner Institute, this is looking at housing prices relative to household income. And if you've got, affordability is, the upper limit on affordability is about 3 to 1. 20 years ago, we were at about 3 to 1. Where are we now? We're 5 to 1. So it's not as bad as it was a couple years ago, but it's still really bad. Housing is severely unaffordable in Utah right now. And what do we do to address that? And I'll tell you, everyone's trying to figure it out. The legislature's trying to figure it out. Governor's trying to figure it out. Local government is working on this. The League of Cities and Towns and the Association of Counties, but it's really tough to fix. Now, one of the solutions is you either need to see a drop in home prices, or you need to see a big increase in wages. And we are seeing a large increase in wages, so that's a good sign of a strong economy, is that it is responding the right way. Nationally, wage growth is right, just under 5%. Utah's closer to 5.5%, so another good sign. At the same time, our median household income in Utah is one of the highest in the country. One of the few states that has a median household income above 100,000. And so that's really kind of remarkable. Now, a reason for that, I mean, you all know this, kind of our unique demographics, right? We've got a lot of per capitas running around, and we make all our kids work. And so, you know, because of that, it kind of gives us a higher median household size and also that household income. But it doesn't shield the fact that we do have, our households have higher buying power and more of a cushion than other parts of the country. And then kind of looking at our broad measure, gross domestic product by state, again, the nation's growing around 2% last year. We grew closer to 3%. So again, you just see this over and over again, yet that, yeah, Utah does have struggles. And there are issues that we need to be dealing with, especially with affordability. But our overall measures of the strength of the economy continue to be really robust. With that, thanks so much for having me. And I'm gonna, okay, I have to tell you something funny. I do this all the time. I do public speaking a lot, so I do the job that everyone would rather die than do. And I do it enough that I don't get nervous about it. However, I got really nervous because at the beginning of this, because Sean came to me and said, Robert, you're gonna introduce Laura. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to introduce someone. So I'm a little nervous introducing someone as esteemed as Laura. So I actually have her bio in front of me, which you're not supposed to do. But she's the Director of Industry Research at the Kempsey Gardner Institute. We all know Gardner. They're one of the best research organizations in our state, and Laura directs a lot of that research. Her specialty is healthcare research, but she's also an expert on the economy and on public policy. Before being at the Gardner Institute, she was at Levitt Partners, where she also directed public policy. And before that, she worked for the Utah Foundation. So we're really lucky to have her. Welcome, Laura.
Yes, I was going to say probably 2008 to 2011. I worked at the Utah Foundation, which I think was way before Sean's time, but it's great to be back. I loved my time at the Utah Foundation, and so excited to present today. So as mentioned, I get to talk about sort of the less exciting news, although I don't know if that was super positive from Robert. I think there was a lot of mixed messages in there. And I'm also going to cover some positive things as well, because even though we have continuously ranked pretty poor on our mental health measures, I do think there's some silver linings that we can highlight that I'm going to try to showcase in my presentation as well. So yes, we do not rank very well in terms of mental health. Utah has an interesting juxtaposition where we rank really well on our physical health measures. We're usually in the top 10, at least the top 5. It depends on the measure you're looking at. A lot of that is related to our young population. We have a lot of children in our state, which keeps our overall measures pretty healthy. But if you look at our mental health rankings, they are not great. Mental Health America is a community-based organization that comes up with a composite score to rank every state on mental health. They're primarily looking at prevalence and access. When I first started getting into mental health research, it was about 2018. It was kind of the first big project that I worked on at the Gardner Institute, and we actually ranked for adults 51st in the nation. So according to Mental Health America, we had the worst mental health for adults in the entire country. I pulled up that same report last night because I was like, surely we've gotten a little bit better. Anyone want to take a guess where we rank today in 2025? 50. You are right. So I was a little surprised. I thought it would be a little higher than that. I've heard we've bounced around a little bit, and the data is lagged, and it's a composite measure, so you do need to sort of understand what's in that. But I was a little surprised that we were still ranking so low. We do rank much better in terms of our youth mental health, so that is a silver lining. But just in terms of mental health overall, we do know that demand exists in our state of Utah. We do have some mental health issues that we need to address. That demand demand exists across the population lifespan. You can see some rankings here. We do have a high share, or the highest share, of parents who are reporting not dealing well with coping as being parents, or mothers of young children, that's children under age 3 that are not coping well or have poor mental health. That impacts the mental health of those infants and young children. I've had the opportunity to work on some early childhood mental health studies, and I would say young children do have mental health, and so then you see that trajectory throughout the course of their life if that's not getting addressed. That second sort of chart shows children ages 3 to 17. We rank in the top 10 both for children in that age group that have anxiety and depression. And then I would say that last bucket, which is really focusing on adults, that's where you sort of see sort of our poorest rankings that may be influencing our lowest ranking in terms of that adult mental health. But we rank second highest in terms of adults with any mental illness. We rank highest in terms of adults with serious mental illness, and we rank highest in terms of adults with serious thoughts of suicide, which I know Sean alluded to there as well. Now these are broad measures. This is for the entire state, and we do know that this varies by population and other areas. So I thought I'd just highlight a couple different points. This shows the share of adults reporting poor mental health by income. You do see that those earning less than $25,000 a year have about twice the rate of those earning $75,000 or more. So it certainly does vary by your socioeconomic status. We also know that it varies by geography, but I would say not as much as maybe people think. We do see that suicide rates tend to be higher in sort of rural areas overall, but this is showing the share of adults reporting poor mental health by Utah's small area, which allows us to look at the data at kind of a smaller, maybe more neighborhood area. And these are the different small areas, kind of city neighborhood areas that actually have shares of adults reporting poor mental health that are statistically higher than the state average. So you got areas like Brigham City, Ogden, Magna, downtown Salt Lake, Murray, Midvale, West Jordan, West Valley. So again, there's not always a clear divide in terms of geography and that impact on mental health. I also looked at some data, and it also depends on the data that you're looking at too. There's a measure that looks at adults with depression, and I'm not sure if it's the same one that you pulled in terms of our state ranking, but those show different rankings. That actually is diagnosed depression. So you do see different cities. Some of the top cities in that one are Bountiful, Centerville. The avenues in the past have really popped. Again, the difference with that one is it's diagnosed depression. So you actually have to have access to healthcare to get a diagnosis. So again, depending on the measure you're looking at, you're going to see different cities kind of pop to the top. And then, of course, age. I know youth mental health is a big issue and concern for our state. We really started to see youth mental health needs start to increase starting in 2015 and kind of continue to increase through the pandemic. So this graph shows high mental health needs among our middle and high school students, as well as depression, suicide ideation, suicide plans, and suicide attempts. One of those silver linings are we are starting to see a little bit of a drop in those share of those students who are reporting these over time. So kind of past the pandemic, we started to see those come down a little bit. It'll be interesting to see when this report comes out in 2 years, kind of what those percentages look like. And then I do think it's important to look at some of those risk factors as well. So this is the same sort of population. It's the share of middle and high school students feeling isolated, sad, or hopeless. Again, you kind of start to see those dip a little bit in 2023, a little bit more in 2025. But I still found it incredibly startling that we have almost 1 in 5 of our middle and high school students who are feeling isolated from others, and almost 1 in 4 that are feeling sad or hopeless. So again, a lot that we can be doing to address our youth mental health. I am an economist by training, so we kind of talked about the demand for mental health. So now I have to switch to the supply, looking at what does that mean in terms of our state. And I would say, again, this is an area that I think is getting better, and we've actually seen some improvements in the data. But we still have about 30% of our youth who are not getting treatment, not receiving treatment, who actually need treatment. That share actually increases if you look at a broader age band. So if you extend that down to age 3, that share increases closer to 60%. And that could just be some misinformation or not understanding that those young children have mental health needs and or maybe some hesitation about getting a diagnosis for those young children as well. I think the more interesting point is that 64% of parents report mental health services are difficult or sometimes impossible to obtain for their children in needs of treatment. So again, much more we can be doing to increase that supply, although we are seeing the data trend in a positive direction. This just shows, again, sort of that limited supply. If we're looking at the supply side of things, almost every county, except for 2, are designated mental health shortage areas. And about 70% of our population live in those shortage areas over time. So I think that's just those 2 counties up north, have moved out of being a mental health shortage area probably in the last 3 to 4 years. And then we do continue to have fewer mental health providers per 100,000 people than the national average. I did say I wanted to focus on some silver linings, and I think, again, this is an area we've been studying. We did our first report in 2018, and then we had the opportunity to work on the Behavioral Health Master Plan, which was published in 2024. And I would just say through these 2 reports, definitely the data shows a lot of room for improvement, but I do think the state is moving in a positive direction around all of these issues. I think that our state and our leaders understand that behavioral health needs exist in our state and are working to address them. As part of the Behavioral Health Master Plan, we had the opportunity to conduct 30 formal discussion groups. We talked to a lot of other people. We did hundreds of presentations and talked to probably over 300 people as part of that process. And I can say from that process, we really saw how passionate people are, those who are connected to or receiving services, just about improving Utah's mental health. It's probably some of the most passionate people and workforce that I've ever encountered in really trying to make things better for people in our state. And I think there's also a desire to meet the needs where people are and really make sure that services are accessible. So I wanted to throw that in there because, again, this is something that we don't rank well on. We have not historically ranked well on. Definitely have work to improve, but there is a lot of activities and people who are passionate in this area. One of these areas, which kind of conflicts with the data Sean showed, is that we are seeing some really positive movements in our overall suicide rates. So we were forever probably in the top 3 states in terms of having the highest suicide rates in our country. In 2019, that fell to 6th. And then the latest data, which is 2024, we actually rank 11th. And I know this is an area where our state has put a lot of effort, both in terms of suicide prevention and crisis response, really building out access to those 2 areas. And hopefully we're starting to see that in the data. Clearly 11th is not great. There's definitely room to go, but seeing those drops over time and seeing us move from top 3 to 6 to 11th, I think sort of speaks to some of the improvements that we're seeing in this area. So I will close there and move on to discussion. So.
We're going to turn to the broader group for some questions and maybe just ask you to introduce yourself, and if you can limit your question to about 30 seconds, that'll allow more questions to be answered. So are there some, please?
I have a question for Mr. Spendlove and then a question for Ms. The gentle lady.
Summers.
Summers. So I have not, I'm seeing the broad picture, but I'm not seeing, if you could include some charts on the breakdown of these depression and suicide rates by gender, by attendance in either public school, private school, home schools, and things like that. That would really, the zoomed in approach would be a little bit more informative. And with Mr. Spendlove, I am, I have been in Utah for almost 27 years. I've never seen so much disconnect between the numbers and how people are feeling and the reality on the ground. Just for example, the inflation rate, you're describing inflation rate as high 3s, low 4s, but the inflation rate is probably like 10, 12% at least.
I'm going to just cut you off and give him a chance to answer, and then I think there's 2 questions there, Robert. You want to answer the economic, and then I just didn't know if there's a deeper breakdown on the other research.
Yeah, so the primary question is about this breakdown between the data and how people feel. And you're right, we're seeing that. And it's true both at the national level and at the state level. So I guess the point is there's not an easy answer. I'll just tell you that right now. In economics, we're trying to use imperfect measures to try to represent or explain what's happening in the real world. And sometimes we do okay, but usually we don't do very well. And so and I'll just tell you, all the data is flawed. It is always flawed. And I don't care what your data is. Like I can tell pretty accurately what the population of this room is, right? I have no idea what the population of the state of Utah is, right? There's no way to count that. Even the Census Bureau cannot accurately count the population of the state of Utah or Salt Lake City because we're moving around and we don't want to be counted. And so then so when you've got difficulty in collecting the data and then using that data, and that's the best data, right? Inflation, what's the best measure? Do you use a basket of goods and services? When do you collect it? How do you collect it? Who are you collecting it from? It's really hard. And so that's just getting the data. And then interpreting the data correctly and then making assumptions or forecasts based on that data is really problematic. And I'll tell you, no one does it well. Think about 5 years ago, the last time we saw a big surge in inflation, and the Federal Reserve Bank called it transitory, right? They said, this is temporary, don't worry, it's gonna go away on its own. They were wrong. And they have thousands of PhD economists, advising them, and they got it wrong. And so, then you kind of fast forward to now, do we look through this current surge of inflation? There's a chance that this inflation is once again transitory. But is it? I don't know. I guess it depends on how quickly we get back out of Iran and how quickly we reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But the longer it takes to get out of there, the more difficult it's going to be. But all of this is just, it's the nature of economics, is that it's a very imperfect science, and so we're always trying to figure out, so number one, where did we get it wrong? Because we always get it wrong. And then, what can we do to kind of adjust that and try to understand what's happening better?
Laura, did you have any response to the other question?
No, only to say that I absolutely agree with you. When you do start breaking down the data, it does become much more helpful in terms of understanding where there is need, maybe where to best put resources to address them. I've never seen data broken out by public school versus private school. That would be super interesting to look at. Yes, absolutely. I would say on the gender, again, it varies by the measure that you're looking at. Women tend to have higher rates of reported and diagnosed mental health, self-reported poor mental health and diagnosed depression. Some of that could be a cultural thing with men not wanting to report or get a diagnosis. On the flip side, men do tend to have higher suicide rates, and you do see that difference there. So absolutely, fully agree with you. It's hard to do in a 5-minute presentation, but the more you can break down the data, either by geography, by population, by gender, by age, the better picture that you get. So.
Okay.
We have a couple reports that I'd be happy to direct you to or show you where you can pull some of that. So, yeah.
Next question. Oh, please, Peter. And then I think I saw a hand back there, and I'll go to you next.
Thank you. A question on causation. So we have high mental health rates. Do we know what's causing it? I hear people say it's because we have stresses from having large families, or somebody said it's because we live at a high elevation. So do we know why?
That is a great question. I actually told Sean, I was like, if anybody asks that question, I'm not going to be able to answer it. So, I mean, honestly, I think we don't. I mean, there's a lot of ideas. There's some good research around why. I don't think there is one thing that points to it. We definitely heard the elevation. There is some, correlation data that shows higher elevation have higher suicide rates. Definitely, have heard the cultural issue before. I think, in terms of addressing mental health, it was put on maybe the back burner for a long time. I do think our state in the last 10 years or more has made some really great progress in terms of getting people access. So I did say I'd throw it back out to the audience if anybody has any ideas of why, but I don't think there's a good, just one answer to that question. But
Sean, you looked like you were grabbing the mic. Did you have something to
Yeah,
add?
I was just going to follow up on some of those issues that Laura brought up. But I think that one of the nice things I think about having organizations like the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute and the Utah Foundation in the state is that we want to look at different policies and whatnot. And I earlier on I showed a slide like how do you affect the change? What can you do to benefit Utahns? I showed a slide earlier about some mental health statistics, and those came from Pew Research Center. And they found that if you for the people that die by suicide, about a half of them, which seems kind of wild to me, about half of them saw a doctor within the month before they died by suicide. So and one of their suggestions because of that is, well, what if you have a mental health screening or a suicide screening, maybe a very short one when you're seeing a physician, and maybe it's before, you may only have 3 minutes with your physician. Maybe it's the physician's assistant or somebody ahead of time. So there are, I think, some things that can be done to ameliorate this. But like Laura said, there's probably not one main thing. But I've seen some studies related to all of the things that Laura brought up.
Thank you. And then there was a question back there to my left.
Hi, Brookwood with the Policy Project. My question was actually really similar if we had any data on some of the upstream factors leading to our mental health numbers. But I wanted to ask specifically, I see this number pulled out around lack of providers and the need for increased providers, and wanted to know if we have comparative data with other states, if that seems to be similar with other states who are kind of tracking higher in mental health needs, or if that happens to be something unique about Utah that needs to be solved.
yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I've looked directly at that comparison, but that would be super interesting to see, especially if you look at sort of the prevalence needs. Does that also match sort of the access need? My guess is you probably would see some connection between those 2 points. I would say it's also really hard to measure sort of provider access. I threw a couple measures up on the slide where you can talk about mental health shortage areas. You can talk about how sort of the number of providers per population compares to the national average. All of those are good indicators. I don't know if any of those are like great measures in terms of whether people are getting access to the care they need, only because there's so many other factors that go into the access issue, like insurance. What does your insurance cover? What does your insurance not cover? Do you have the financial resources to pay for mental health? We, at least when we did the behavioral health master plan, one of the big challenges we heard was there was a lot of providers who are moving to cash pay only, which is kind of unique to the mental health space. Problem is then it creates an access issue. So we may have a great number of providers compared to the national average per population, but if those providers are only taking cash, that's going to cut the number of people that are going to have access to mental health. So it's a very complicated question, and there's a lot of nuances that you need to think within it. So.
Thank you. Well, why don't we come here? Oh, sorry. Then we'll come, I promise. Josh.
Have you done any studies on social media? And I'm wondering if these numbers will improve as our schools are limiting access to social media. I know that we don't have data yet on that, but I just wonder if you've seen any correlation, because a lot of this seems to have ramped up with with the ramp up of social media?
Yeah, absolutely. There was the Surgeon General a few years ago released a big report about the connection between social media and youth mental health. And I did point it out in that graph, but I was wondering if somebody would pick up on it. It sounds like you did. 2015, that was the first year we really started to see that significant ramp up in our youth mental health needs. 2015 was also the time that phones, iPhones, smartphones really became more common and started becoming more common. So again, I don't know if you can say causation. I would say definitely correlation. And it was something that the Surgeon General at least put out a few years ago, just talking about the negative impact that social media has on our youth mental health. So hopefully it's starting to, we are seeing it start to trend down. I don't know if we have enough data yet to see if we're going to continue to see those youth mental health indicators continue to come down, or if it's going to be sort of just a 1 year, 2 year blip and then we'll continue to go back up. But I do think we are starting to understand the impacts of social media better, and maybe that's one sort of factor that's influencing those downward trends. So
Sorry, Josh Kraft, Utah Clean Energy, and thanks, fans. Not many fans, but primarily for Robert. But would love to response of everyone here. I've heard this term vibe session being thrown around a lot, and it's like the idea that even though some of the major economic indicators that anyone who reads the newspaper would recognize, growth, unemployment, inflation, are not that bad, that a lot of folks are feeling not great. And Robert, some of the slides you looked at kind of hinted at an answer that, some of the big costs in our life, like housing, are maybe not being solved by traditional measures of growth. But I'm just response to that, and any thoughts on if vibe session is going to stick around as a term?
Well, yeah, no, and it's a cool term, so it should. But part of the problem is it's really hard, kind of back to what I said earlier, it's hard to represent what we're all seeing in graphs. We all know what's going on. We can all feel it. But then you're like, well, show me a graph that, an economic graph that represents what I'm seeing in reality. And, the best one is that consumer sentiment. So you can't deny that people don't feel good. But then there's, but then you look at the stock market's doing great, right? And so that would say, well, we're fine. You look at GDP's fine. The jobs report, way up. And so I think a lot of this, another one of the theories is this, we call it a bifurcation of the economy, or K-shaped economy, where the benefits are really being consolidated to the upper income, where, you go back, and I think a lot of this was caused by the reaction to the pandemic. I think it was, the pandemic was kind of like setting off a bomb in society, and there's a lot of distortions. And some of them are mental, some of them are economic, some of them are public policy. But the public policy response was we increased the money supply by $6 trillion following the pandemic. Where did that money go? Well, initially it went everywhere. It went to everyone, PPP loans, rental assistance, unemployment assistance, direct checks. But over time, that money is kind of consolidated. The lower income are now tapped out, and upper income represent the majority of spending. The top 10% of wage earners right now represent more than 50% of spending in America. And so if you're just looking at your top level measures of the economy, they don't reflect that. But that is, if you listen to like earnings calls of major companies, they're talking about this, they're feeling it. And so it's hard to represent, but I think it is that bifurcation. And the next question I always get is, well, when do we start to see this? When do we start to see the consumer changing? And I don't know. It's been 6 months away for 3 years. And so I don't know when we're going to see it, but maybe the result is not economic, but it's political. And some of the political pressures that we've seen the last couple of years, I think, are driven by this economic stress.
Do either of you have other comments to the vibe?
No, I mean, ultimately, I think Robert just was much more eloquent in the way he was showing this than my kind of blunt stick of showing some prices of basketball games. But I think that it does seem like when that is really what's happening is that sure, all this stuff looks great. The stock market looks great when the people that are buying the stocks are that top 10% of the wealth and wage earners in the nation. So it does, I think, do a good job at kind of hiding the struggles that people are feeling.
Let me go back here to the next question.
I'm Suzanne Highland, a City Council member of Cottonwood Heights. Robert, do you have a sense of the variability and affordability in the state of Utah? And the reason that comes to mind, I'm also trained as an economist in supply and demand. We are geographically bound along the Wasatch Front between two mountain ranges. And you compare us to other urban areas like Houston and Phoenix and Las Vegas that can sprawl forever. And so they have more affordability. They don't have as many, well, everybody has affordability problems. But is it more concentrated here? I had a friend who just bought a lot in Cottonwood Heights for $1 million. If you put a tent on it, it's not affordable. So can you address the variability and then maybe what's happening here in Salt Lake?
Yeah, and that is a big part of the problem is, well, it's not a problem. It's the unique characteristics of living in Utah, which is, we've got mountains everywhere, and then we've got, the Great Salt Lake, and so there really isn't a lot of buildable land compared to a place like Texas, where you just keep going forever. And, and so it's a lot easier to be more affordable in a place like Texas. And, I think there's a combination of, the three main components of real estate is land, labor, and capital, right? And so we've got limited land, limited labor, but it's not too bad. Limited capital, meaning access to affordable supplies. And so I think that is having the impact. One of the biggest ones, though, because we could just continue to build out west, right? We could just keep going to Wendover, but it's also the availability of water. So water is a limiting factor, and we've got, and it's getting worse, right? We all know that this year we're in a drought, we're in a water crisis. We've got to get serious about our water use, and because it will continue to become a bigger strain on those limited resources.
Let me come right here for our final question, and apologies.
Better be good. Richard Marcosian with Utah Stories. And more of the people I'm talking to address exactly the point you brought up, that the middle and lower classes feel like they're just kind of being left out of the economy, and that the upper echelons are doing awesome. And so there's this growing divide between sentiment, and I think that's pointed out in the data as well. A question for both of you: what would you recommend policy-wise could help solve this problem of just this growing divide between the middle class and upper echelons?
Well, see, that's the hard part. The easy part is saying, well, it's even, I just mentioned, it's hard saying what's actually happening. It's even harder to say, what do you do about it? What's the proper policy response? And I think it depends on where you come down politically, right? And you see these, but I do think that's why you're seeing this rise of populism. And populism is neither Democrat or Republican. It's essentially throw the bums out. And we're seeing two different forms of this populism. On the right, it's we need to tear it all down. We need to get rid of all these government regulations that are constraining us. On the left, it's we need to tax the rich and redistribute wealth. And I think the answer is probably somewhere in between the two. But that's the hard part, and that's why we have elected officials. That's why we're lucky to have a lot of elected officials in the room today. And so they've got the tough job of trying to figure out how to deal with this. And it's a real struggle.
I also think, so I started off with the first data point of social capital. I think there's something about people coming together and figuring these things out together that I think could go a long ways. And it's things as fundamental as yeah, I would love my kid to move in with me. People talk about like, oh, I can't wait for the kid to get out of the basement. And it's like, my kid was out of the house when she wasn't even 18 yet. And I'm like, come back. Like you moved back into Utah after figuring San Diego State wasn't the right place. But now that you're at the U, you could live in our basement. You're so awesome. And I think it's some of that. It's like, that would make her housing a heck of a lot cheaper. My mom at some point is going to need to live somewhere, probably not on her own. I definitely don't want her to live in my basement, but maybe I should like work on that. Maybe like there is something about that like that cost of living. Housing is a big cost of living. If you could maybe bring some people together like that, or other kind of social capital methods where you can maybe get like the ennui that maybe young people are feeling, or the concerns around never being able to buy a house and the existential crises with all the things going on in the world, and maybe some of that social capital stuff, building those types of bonds could go a long ways in benefiting and beyond all of the political. Like there's so much nonsense that we hear all over the place out there. Maybe there's something that we can do. This is maybe a populist kind of viewpoint. Maybe there's something we can do without all that noise and just come together and work together and feel better about life, and that'll help with some of the hurdles that we have to deal with in terms of suicide and mental health and mental illness and whatnot.
With that, if you just conclude with. If you haven't joined the Utah Foundation and your organization is interested, we'd love to have that conversation with you. And just on a lighter note, we're all moving over to the Teigen residence, and so that'll solve our problem and open up a lot of housing for everybody else. And with that, thank you for being with us today.